Hello, so this lecture is about abortion, and I'll draw on the reading from the syllabus about abortion in Ireland and the politics of abortion in Ireland in relation to the building of the nation state, the treatment of migrants, and the politics of race, as well as systemic racism and hate crimes. The author for the reading discusses a case in Ireland where a woman died trying to have an abortion. The politics of abortion have never been separate from debates regarding eugenics and the making of an imagined pure nation state, and the genocide of those who are deemed to be minorities. And abortion has always been connected to eugenics and mass atrocities against racialized others. Nazi Germany's eugenics laws severely punished abortion for Aryan women, but permitted abortion on wider and more explicit grounds than before if the fetus was believed to be deformed or disabled, or if termination otherwise was deemed desirable on eugenic grounds, such as the child or either parent suspected of being carrier of a genetic disease. So we'll discuss the relationship between the Nazis and the construction of disability and health later on in the class when we discuss gender, feminism, and disability and the politics of health. Sterilization of the parents also took place in some such cases. In cases where the parents were Jewish, abortion was also not punished. During World War II, anti-abortion laws were increased again, and it became a capital offense. In 1943, a law was passed making it punishable by death to provide a German woman with an abortion. Non-Aryan women, meanwhile, were often encouraged to utilize contraception and abortion in order to reduce their populations. So Adam Rutherford has written this book called Control that discusses eugenics. What does the word eugenics bring to mind? For many, it is Nazi Germany and the atrocities that were committed in its name, not least the murder and involuntary sterilization of people that they deemed unworthy of reproducing. But eugenics didn't begin or end with the Nazis. In fact, writes geneticist Adam Rutherford in his new book, Control, the idea persisted and persists. I'll put a link to the article that this quote is from about this book, Control, in case you're interested in looking at it for future studies or future writing for your own interest. So the politics of eugenics and abortion becomes even more complicated globally when we think about female infanticide in India and in the Indian diaspora, and the use of reproductive technology to abort female fetuses. So a study published in the Globe and Mail in 2017 found that there's an imbalance in children, a gender imbalance in children born to Indo-Canadian women. Karen Howlett, writing in the Globe and Mail, writes that fewer girls than boys are born to Indian women who immigrate to Canada. Howlett discusses this study that was published in the Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology Canada. And the study finds that the preference for boys does not diminish regardless of how long women from India have lived in Canada. Howlett writes, for many Indian immigrants who express a strong desire for sons, the study found the practice of sex selection remains entrenched. Women who already have 2 female children are most at risk for abortions in the second trimester when parents can learn the sex of the fetus. The study builds on previous research led by Dr. Marcelo Uriquia, has conducted this research and found a deficit in Canada of more than 4,400 girls over 2 decades. So the study suggests that there are over 4,400 Indo-Canadian or South Asian Canadian or girls who would have been part of the Indian diaspora who were not born. So I'll play a clip regarding female infanticide. In India, writes this journalist, families are only considered complete when they have a son. Girls are often aborted or even killed after birth, in spite of government campaigns. A doctor in Pune is fighting this tradition with lots of persuasion.
What can one idea do? Ready. One idea can help me, a running back.
So the latest study in Canada, or the study from 2017, shows that women born in India who already have 2 daughters gave birth to 192 baby boys in Ontario for every 100 girls. The sex ratios are so distorted, they cannot be explained by natural causes, Dr. Uriquia said. Across the globe, by comparison, the odds of having a boy over a girl are slightly higher, 107 boys for every 100 girls. The preference for boys among many Indian immigrants reveals underlying gender inequities and will not change without intervention, said the researcher. It was rare to hear about a girl's birth being celebrated, said Amanpreet Brar, a third-year medical student at the University of Toronto, who worked on the study. In India, the ratio of male to female newborns varies considerably, with several northern states consistently showing numbers that favor boys, the study says. The practice of sex selection is not widespread across India, but it is prevalent, said Kripa Sekar, executive director of the South Asian Women's Center in Toronto. Many members of the community welcome a girl child, she said. It's a small minority of the community in Canada that still practices this. Sekar also said this is an issue of choice that is taken away from a woman. In many ways, it is very abusive. So misogyny, I think, is at the core of a lot of the debates regarding abortion and who speaks for whom and who has control over whose body and whose life.
You started with yoga for beginners.
So the article discusses the death of Savita Halappanavar, and the author talks about how it shocked Irish society. Savita Halappanavar was a migrant to Ireland from India. So the author of the article from the Feminist Review writes that my argument is that beyond being a woman who unnecessarily died in childbirth, in Ireland's post-Catholic patriarchy, Halappanavar was a migrant woman whose death requires theorizing the Republic of Ireland as a gendered racial state. On the other hand, her death led to renewed demands for the promised legislation regarding the equal weight of the lives of the unborn, the mother, as voted for in a 1983 constitutional referendum. On the other hand, strengthened Ireland's pro-life movement resolve to oppose any legislation for abortion. So what the author is discussing then is the relationship between this kind of building of a gendered racial state and debates regarding who can and cannot have children in Ireland. Interrogating the politics of birth in Ireland, this paper argues that abortion is central to the construction of contemporary Irish identities. And I'll fix these slides when I post them online. So this case and who can and cannot have children in Ireland and who can and cannot be considered to be Irish is really about the use of abortion and the use of women's bodies to build a certain nation state. And this racist construction of a pure nation state that also relies on the forced reproduction of certain women and the refusal to see certain women as mothers has been central to genocidal countries and to histories of genocide, from the Nazis to the politics of sterilization in white settler nation states like Canada. So many women have alleged coerced sterilization in a class action lawsuit being filed, or that was filed in Canada. This is a clip about
Your dream, but
alleged coerced sterilization of Indigenous women in Turtle Island or Canada.
Vacation plans probably don't include hepatitis A or B.
calls are growing louder for a public inquiry into allegations of coerced sterilization of Indigenous women. There's a long and gruesome history of this practice in Canada, but a new class action lawsuit alleges it happened as recently as last year. The lawsuit involves over 80 women so far. This week, a prominent First Nations leader called the issue a crisis. Some of the accusations are nothing short of horrifying.
A social worker came in and that's when she told me, we want you to have a tubal ligation. And I didn't want it. And I told her no. And then that's when she's like, well, we don't want you leaving this hospital until it's done.
That's Brenda Pelche saying she was badgered by nurses to sign a consent form only moments after she gave birth. Others say they were lied to, told the sterilization process could be reversed. We know in some cases, sterilization happens under the guise of concerns over family planning. In 2017, the Saskatoon Health Region acknowledged some of these allegations and apologized. There are laws protecting people from forced procedures, but experts say that isn't enough. And joining me to talk about all of this is Vice Chief of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, Heather Baer. So, Heather, you've spoken to a lot of Indigenous women about what they say happened to them. What do you want to see done?
Well, first of all, I think we need to put an end to it. We need to compensate. We need to address and see what supports these women need. And of course, we need to look at making sure it doesn't happen again. And I'd like to see, the criminalization of this practice happen so that there is a stronger deterrent, because the criminal code as is not working. So I think we need to revisit that, and I would like to call on our senators, for example, to support a bill to amend the Criminal Code of Canada, to criminalize sterilization of Indigenous women and girls.
Can you tell me about a case in particular that struck you?
Well, they all strike me as very disturbing, but I know in one case, a woman was begging for them to stop, and she could literally, smell the fire as she was, her tubes were being cauterized, and it just a thought, and to imagine that happening, and her despair and the pain.
Is it true that you've heard that some women have been told that they can't see their babies unless they sign that piece of paper?
It's just dreadful and just heart-wrenching to hear, how nurses and professionals could be so uncompassionate and disrespectful of the desires and, when it comes to how our people are treated. Not only with this issue, but other issues. But right now, this is a critical issue that needs to be addressed immediately and condemned.
The Prime Minister speaks often of his commitment to righting wrongs for Indigenous people. Has he been supportive?
Well, I've heard it condemned, but like I say, for our Indigenous people, justice, she is not blind. And that's where I'm kind of drawing the line here in terms of, what people say, what people do is more important. And I think he has the power to make government accountable and the people accountable for this heinous, disturbing, repulsive crimes against our women.
So there are a lot of different debates that are being had currently around the world regarding
Welcome
abortion.
everyone to Take Charge for April.
And if you're interested in writing about abortion or thinking about it in terms of future research or future law school applications, it is an interesting issue that is being debated right now. So today, Reuters reported that Ecuador's National Assembly on Thursday approved regulations to allow women and girls access to abortions in cases of rape, amid widespread debate about the issue in the mostly conservative country. The vote came comes after the Constitutional Court gave the green light for abortion in cases of rape last April and ordered legislatures to speedily regulate the procedure. So debates regarding abortion after rape are also being had throughout the world, and these debates are about religion often, and also about the rights of survivors of rape. And they're also about the functioning of public health care, particularly in countries in the global south. So abortion is never just about abortion. It is really about a broader set of debates regarding gendered and sexual ideology in a certain time period, in a certain place. The place could be a certain province or state. It could be an entire nation state. The rights of survivors of rape and sexual assaults and child sexual abuse, and the right to have an abortion are really, I think, fundamental rights for women and girls. And also for people who might identify as non-binary or transgender, but be survivors of rape and abuse and want to have an abortion. The contentious nature of abortion and the ways that debates regarding abortion resurface again and again, even in instances where people have been raped, I think are really about control, and more than just being about patriarchal control over a womb and over reproduction. I think they speak to a wider desire to control the future nation state. So what I would argue, drawing on my own research about India and sexual violence and sexual politics in India, is that when there is a rise in religious nationalism, the politics of abortion become very contentious, and I think this also corresponds with the rise in gender-based violence, including rape and sexual violence, particularly against certain groups of women. So historically, Ireland's biopolitics of birth involved incarcerating thousands of fallen women in Magdalene laundries run by religious orders between 1922 and 1996, with the full knowledge of the state, in what Ireland's premier called, in his public apology, a cruel and pitiless Ireland. Most recently, responding to moral panic about migrant women childbearing against the state. After briefly outlining the ramifications of what became known as the X case, this paper argues that the birthing and reproductive functions of women in Ireland have always been policed, controlled, and abused, and that The racial state is also a state of exception, where some populations are cast as what Agamben calls bare life or homo sacer, at the mercy of sovereign power. So the construction of this state in which there's an imagined pure race or religious community of people, rather than a state that upholds laws regarding meritocracy and migrant rights, is, I think, about a certain imagined order where men, cisgender men, who occupy the most privileged positions in a society have the right to determine who lives and who dies and whose body can be used as a target of rape and sexual violence, and whose body can be used to reproduce certain religions and imagined pure citizens. So this is a clip about Ireland and the abortion debate.
You got this, Dad. Always growing. What we learn from play, we learn for life.
The young woman on these banners stumbled unknowingly into Ireland's abortion grey area, and these people believe she paid for it with her life. Thousands marched in Dublin to express their sadness at the death of Savita Halapanova and to demand legislation on exactly when a doctor is allowed to abort a fetus.
She was a woman who needed our help. She needed the help of a medical team who understood what the guidelines were, that they could fulfill the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. And they had no clarity. And they need that clarity so that they can save a life.
The miscarrying 31-year-old was denied a termination in an Irish hospital and later died in agony of blood poisoning. The case has galvanised those in Ireland who say when it comes to deciding between the life of a mother and the life of a fetus, the country's laws are broken. Ireland's strong Catholic tradition means it constitutionally prohibits abortions. But in 1992, the Supreme Court decreed that if a mother's life was being endangered by carrying the baby, termination is permitted. That ruling, though, has never made it into law.
Abortion is a constitutional right, as determined by the Supreme Court 20 years ago under the X case. But there's no legal underpinning of that. There's no legislation to vindicate that right. Only in certain circumstances, only when the life of the mother is at risk. And that was the determination made 20 years ago. But without legislation, it's a total grey area. And those in the medical fields are unsure as to what to do. And that's the problem.
But for those on the other side of the debates, Ireland already has all the abortion legislation it needs.
The clinical guidelines for medical doctors state that they can treat a woman when her life's at risk. And if that means inducing the pregnancy, then that is able to happen here already.
But the momentum at the moment is with the pro-abortion rights campaigners. Ireland's ruling politicians are under immense pressure to do what 6 successive governments have avoided doing, finally legislating on the Supreme Court's ruling. Plus, these campaigners urging change either. The European Court of Human Rights has given Ireland until the end of the month to present its proposals for new laws. The death of one 31-year-old woman may well sweep away 2 decades of deadlock.
So the debates regarding abortion in Ireland are not just about this one case, obviously, but are about a wider set of political debates regarding who can and cannot be Irish, but also even more fundamentally, from a philosophical perspective, these debates are really about which women and which people are allowed to live. And the case of Savita is one of many tragic cases in which a racist patriarchal state really gets to decide who lives and who dies. So the author, writing in the Feminist Review, states that Ireland has a long history of pitching good Catholic married mothers versus bad unmarried mothers. However, Savita Halappanavar died not merely as a woman whose reproductive practices are controlled by Irish patriarchy, but as a migrant woman whose body is othered, as emerged from the debates around the citizenship referendum, which made gendered Black bodies central to the rearticulation of Irishness as white supremacy. Since mothering carries a property of otherness, the author frames migrant women as M/others mothers, denoting their otherness. These debates regarding the constitution of a nation state, race, and abortion are also being had in other countries like the United States of America. And one of the secondary articles for this week discusses debates regarding abortion in Texas. When Texans woke up on the morning of September 1st, writes the journalist whose article is listed in the syllabus, and there's a link to the article. And they write that Texans woke up on the morning of September 1st, one of their basic rights was gone. Over the summer, Governor Greg Abbott signed into law two of the most extreme anti-abortion laws in the country. The article is written by Jessica Cisneros. And they further write, one bans abortion as early as 6 weeks before many people even know they're pregnant, and emboldens almost any private citizen to sue abortion providers and others suspected of helping someone seeking abortion care, including family members, rideshare drivers, and even clergy members. The other would outlaw abortion if Roe v. Wade is overturned by the Supreme Court of the United States with no exceptions for rape or incest. So these debates in Texas, I think, are obviously also about white nationalism and the last 10 years of politics in the United States, and the politics of who is and is not an American, and who has the right to choice in America, and who was also chosen to be an American. So I would argue that we can always return to these debates that have been had in extreme instances, such as Nazi Germany, regarding who can have an abortion and who is supposed to have a child for an imagined pure racist nation state. So this is a clip regarding abortion and white supremacy.
Let me welcome all of you and welcome Michelle Goodwin, our guest. I'm Anu Kumar. I'm president and CEO of IPAS. I'm sure most of you know that IPAS is an international reproductive justice organization. We work to expand access to abortion and contraception because we believe that everyone, no matter where they live and how much money they have, should be able to access safe abortion and determine their own futures. IPAS primarily works in low to middle income countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And our US work is focused primarily on US foreign policy and its impact on reproductive freedom, as well as connecting our international experiences, of which we have a great deal of experience, to domestic experience. So I have a really interesting point of view on this issue of abortion. On the one hand, as an American, I see abortion rights being stripped away, but globally, I see progress from Argentina to Ireland to the DRC and most recently in Mexico. I'm thrilled to be here today with Michelle Goodwin in the first live version of our series, Chats with Changemakers. Professor Goodwin is definitely a change maker. She's an author, an advocate, a professor of law, and a bioethicist. She hosts On the Issues, a podcast at Ms. Magazine, and she's written several books, including Policing the Womb, and has published many, many articles and commentaries for the New York Times, the LA Times, and more. We have a lot to talk about, as both Professor Goodwin and I have written and spoken about the threat of white supremacy that runs through anti-abortion and anti-rights movements and actions. We see this in our foreign policy, like the Helms Amendment. We saw this in the insurrection at the US Capitol, and now we're seeing it with the most recent law in Texas, which is empowering bounty hunters essentially to report anyone connected to abortion. So maybe let's just get started right there with the latest news. Professor Goodwin, can you just give us your reactions to the Texas law and the implications that it has? And as we were chatting before we got started, how is it that the Fifth Circuit can tell the federal court what to do here? Just lay the landscape out for us a little bit.
First of all, thank you so much for the important work that you do and inviting me to be in this conversation with you. It's an honor and privilege for me to be here with you. And you've asked for my reaction. Well, it's alarming what it is that we have seen. And I would encourage people to think about this as our revisiting a playbook that is in seemingly an endless loop in the United States. If you understand and think about the origins in the United States, it's capitalism, what its capitalism relied upon. It relied upon stripping away reproductive autonomy, privacy, liberty, freedom from the people who were enshackled, enslaved, kidnapped from the shores of Africa and brought to the United States to build wealth and capital for states that bought into slavery. Primarily those were in the South, but not exclusively. In the Northeast, eventually they did away with slavery. But at a certain point, 40% of the households in New York had enslaved people that worked for them in those households. But that endless loop includes something that's important for this conversation, which is that it was so deeply ingrained economically in the consciousness, in the culture of the United States, that the federal government enacted laws that would protect individuals who were slave owners, and then furthermore, provide incentives to random Americans to surveil, to spy upon, to track, and literally hunt down Black people as if they were chattel for food and another prey, right? And so if we look back and they're sort of mindful of that history, and we look at Boston, Philadelphia, et cetera, where there would be signs all around these communities urging Black people to be careful, not to come out in daylight, that there were bounty hunters that had a price on their heads. And then if we look at what was written into those laws, they were really quite pernicious and broad in their scope. So they provided bounties for people who were successful in the capture of Black people. But even more, what was fascinating about those laws is how they put a thumb on the scale of the bounty hunter and, of course, the slaveholders. And anything that we can think of now as kind of a judicial legitimacy or what's important in terms of upholding rights, they just simply didn't exist. And so if you're a Black person who was hunted down and was brought into court, you actually had no standing to even be able to speak, to even be able to say, well, I'm 3 generations living in Philadelphia, 3 generations living in Boston, this is wrong. Silence, nothing. So then we sort of look at what is now. And I would say that we've missed out a whole lot if we didn't think about Jim Crow. So after slavery, after its abolition, after Reconstruction, which lasts a very short period of time, the United States Supreme Court allows for this system of separate but equal laws. And I think that we'll see much of this as the kind of narrative that weaves out with what it is that we see in the gutting of Roe and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, because it is exactly that kind of playbook, right? It is this kind of separate but equal status, really, of people who would otherwise seek to have control over their own reproductive destinies. It creates this hierarchy. So you've asked about the Fifth Circuit and the Texas case. And so let me just lay out really quickly the Texas law itself. We're talking about SB 8. Texas calls this a heartbeat bill. I say calls it that because I want to be clear that at 6 weeks of pregnancy, which is what it does, it denies the right to terminate a pregnancy after 6 weeks. At 6 weeks, there is no heart. There is an embryo. So the very notion of baking this language in, the heartbeat legislation, is a misnomer. And then I would hope that, journalists and et cetera would stop deferring into that kind of language. What the law also does is that it provides individuals to seek a bounty against anyone who aids or abets a person after 6 weeks of pregnancy in that termination of the pregnancy. Additionally, it allows for $10,000 at least if they're successful in identifying the person who aided or abetted. The law makes no definition of aid and abet, so it is very broad. So aid and abet could be the person who is the Uber driver or the taxi driver that transports someone to a clinic. It could be a family member who provides some economic support for this. It could be the receptionist at a clinic who registers the patient in. Additionally, it provides for attorney's fees as well. And one final note that I'll make, and then really quickly on the Fifth Circuit, is that what the law also does is it does a work around the traditional structure of laws. That is to say that within a state, when a governor signs a law into action, there is someone who's responsible in the state. Usually that might be the state's attorney general, it may be a secretary of some department, and that person is responsible for enforcement. What Texas decided to do here, and let's be clear, this was not the kind of brilliance of the legislature, this has been a very well-oiled, very well-funded machine in terms of people who have been paid to think about these issues, not a sprint, but a marathon. And the decision was make nobody responsible from the state to enforce, because then an individual could have standing and sue the state.
Okay, I'll stop it there. When I post this online, you'll have access to the entire discussion if you'd like to look at this for your own research or your own personal interest. The point with abortion is that the right to choice has always been about women's rights and people's rights to make decisions about their own lives, irrespective of the role that cisgender heteronormative patriarchies would like them to play. And these debates regarding personal autonomy, control over one's life, and the feminist movement continue. Female infanticide is obviously also an ongoing debate about misogyny and about the complete devaluation of those people who are people who are born who are not cisgender men, and particularly about the horrific treatment of women and girls. So abortion consistently throughout the course of history is really, I think, about hierarchy. And these hierarchies become hierarchies of gender, hierarchies of sex, hierarchies of class, and hierarchies of race, and really hierarchies of human bodies and the role that one is supposed to play, and the reduction of one's entire life and personhood to a role that one is forced to play because of hierarchies of the human body. In the 1990s, Ireland, previously marked by emigration, became an immigration destination. In an attempt to control immigration, the state targeted migrant mothers. After the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922, all people born on the island of Ireland were granted automatic jus soli citizenship, enshrined by the 1937 Constitution and the 1956-1986 Nationality and Citizenship Acts. Prior to 2004, a series of Supreme Court cases in Ireland granted and then denied migrant parents of Irish citizen children the right of residents to give care and company to their citizen child. Anxious about migrant mothers birthing children in Ireland, in 2004, the Minister for Justice removed the process whereby migrant parents could apply to remain on the grounds of having a citizen child. This resulted in some 11,500 migrant parents becoming candidates for deportation. Despite robust lobbying, deportations went ahead, including at least 20 citizen children. So these cases then of migrant parents being deported are really about racist forms of citizenship in which people are not allowed to have access to the same legal rights and protections as those born in Ireland, and particularly white Irish Catholics. So what the author argues is that this racist form of citizenship really then begins to determine who lives and who dies. And Savita's death is really about, in the article, what the author argues, drawing on Giorgio Agamben, is that Savita's death is about the sovereign nation state that can really, that can determine who lives and who dies. So the author draws on Goldberg, who argues that all modern nation states are racial states that aim above all to construct racial homogeneity. So racism is not then something that is personal or casual or something that really fades over time. What Goldberg and other theorists would argue is that all modern nation states are racial states that aim to construct homogeneity among populations who can claim citizenship and who can own property and who can claim middle-class sustainable lives over time, meaning full rights of citizenship. So while nation states might have migrant populations and populations of people of color, their rights of citizenship often become precarious to different degrees. And this precarity can involve poverty, it can involve precarious labor, and it can also involve murder. Giorgio Agamben argues a state of exception in which the sovereign reduces some population categories to bare life, whose Destiny is legally determined by sovereign power, which puts itself above the law. The racial state uses every possible governmental technology, including constitutions, border controls, and population censuses, and the education and welfare systems to construct national homogeneity and categorize the population, often suspending the law and reducing unwanted categories of people to bare life. For Agamben, Homo sacer is the ideal type, excluded being whose life is devoid of value. Therefore, killing or deporting a Homo sacer is not a punishable offense, as his or her life is deemed to be outside the remit of the nation. So this theorization, drawing on Agamben and Goldberg, can be used to make sense of a context in which in Canada, over 4,000 Indo-Canadian or South Asian women have gone missing or were never born, meaning over 4,000 female children who were not white were never born in Canada, at the same time as Savita died trying to have an abortion in Ireland. So Homo sacer is the ideal type, excluded being whose life is devoid of value. Therefore, killing or deporting a Homo sacer is not a punishable offense, as his or her life is deemed to be outside the remit of the nation. So finally, I'll finish by discussing biopolitics. The body of woman creates and contains birth nations, which is why nation states are moved to strictly control female sexuality, and why in Ireland, womanhood and motherhood are represented as synonymous realities. However, globalization, immigration, and the sudden presence of non-ethnic Irish citizens changed the relationship between the state and its mothers. So biopolitics is a term used by Michel Foucault to discuss the administration of life. And examples of biopolitics involve when policies are passed in which the nation state intervenes into the management of life and into the management of death. And examples would be warnings on cigarette packets, warnings on food that involve trying to promote the health of the population. Other examples are when the nation state tries to control who can and cannot immigrate and who can and cannot have children, and also debates regarding abortion. Targeting sexually active Irish women was the preamble to banning and controlling migrant mothers as the producers of future generations of the racially, quote, inferior, leading me to posit migrant mothers as the female version of Homo sacer, Feminist sacra. The official report on Halapenever's death found that there was an overemphasis by hospital staff on her unviable fetus and an underemphasis on her detrimental health. So Savita Halapenever then is discussed in the article as someone who can be killed without recourse to law. And the author uses the terms Homo sacer and Feminist sacra to discuss the one who is sacrificed in order that a certain version of the nation state and a certain racist biopolitics can be supported and advanced. The official report on Halapenever's death found that there was an overt by hospital staff on her unviable fetus. Sorry, an overemphasis by hospital staff. I'll fix the PowerPoints when I post them online. An overemphasis by hospital staff on her unviable fetus and an underemphasis on her detrimental health. So this overemphasis on the unviable fetus and the underemphasis on her detrimental health is really about the value of life and the devaluation of this person's life. My final argument is that Savita Halappanavar's life was sacrificed to her fetus's heartbeat, and she was thus feminist sacra, she who was made to die in order to make live her unborn fetus. Her life sacrificed at the altar of Ireland's church-inspired strict abortion laws, which, despite the 1983 referendum and the 1992 Supreme Court ruling, still tactically privileged the life of the unborn over the life of the mother. Savita Halappanavar did not decide to have a baby in Ireland in order to subvert the integrity of Irish citizenship. After the 2004 referendum, this option was no longer open to her. However, her death, which might be seen as enabling the life of those considered truly Irish or Catholic in this case, tipped the balance of Ireland's anti-abortion regime, inadvertently leading to the government having to table the long-awaited legislation on abortion. So this debate regarding abortion in Ireland and in Texas really constructs different categories of women, namely those who should live and who should live to be the ideal mothers of the nation state, namely white Christian and white Catholic women, and those who should not live. In either case, women are constructed as people who do not have the right to choice. So the imagined mother of the racist white supremacist nation state is a white woman who should not have an abortion but should have a white Christian or Catholic son. And the other mothers or the other non-mothers should also not have the right to have an abortion, as their citizenship rights and their tax dollars do not matter. The case also represents the complex ways in which processes of globalization and migration, leading to structural racial and gender inequities, creates conditions for understanding Ireland as the racial state that it is, where Irish anxieties about mothers who disrupt national and Catholic certainties are still, as Smith stated, already in 1992 being regulated, disciplined, and controlled. So these debates regarding abortion are also debates about migration and about deportation of M/others, which corresponds to the lack of abortion rights for women who are constructed as citizens, namely white, cisgender, Christian, and Catholic women. Bell Hooks writes, to oppress a person is to render this person unable to make his or her own choices. According to Hooks, being oppressed means the absence of choices. It is the primary point of contact between the oppressed and the oppressor. So I would argue that rape and the normalization of rape and the lack of legal rights to survivors of rape and the normalization of white male property owners and their control over women's bodies, just as they control land, is also about the absence of choice in an obscene set of ideological norms in which cisgender men have control over women's bodies. So in the book that I wrote about the Delhi gang rape case, I write about the rising rates of rape against women in India and the rise of religious nationalism. On December 16, 2012, a brutal gang rape and murder occurred that expressed such bodily and emotive violence it is beyond verbal and written translation. There are no words, no metaphors, no quotes or references to express the loss of a person's life. In these instances, one can recall the words of a character from Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. This is not a story to pass on. Perhaps the story to pass on lies in the tremendous courage of those in India who politicize this moment in remarkable ways. So this is a quote from the book I wrote, and I'm obviously pro-choice, and I think there's always a correlation or there's always a relationship between the ways that women can be raped and murdered and killed and the complete lack of choice that women have to have abortions. And I think this is true in a country like India where marital rape continues to be legal. On September 6, 2018, the Supreme Court of India ruled in favor of queer rights, and they read down Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which made it, and the ruling makes it legal to be queer in India. They're now debating queer marriage, and there have been a lot of debates regarding what constitutes a family. I would argue that the rights of queer people, and specifically lesbians and queer women, are central to upholding the rights of choice and sexual and bodily freedom. These endless debates regarding how a nation state can use the bodies of women, I think, are really about colonialism and ongoing histories of colonization, as well as political debates and wars about who constitutes the power-holding majority in a nation state. Michel Foucault writes, the bodies of individuals and the body of populations appears as the bearer of new variables, not merely as between the scarce and the numerous, the submissive and the restive, rich and poor, healthy and sick, strong and weak, but also as between the more or less utilizable, more or less amenable to profitable investment, those with greater or lesser prospects of survival, death, and illness, and with more or less capacity for being usefully trained. The birth of the modern nation and modern capitalism coincides with the birth of the body as an object of state inquiry. The need to control and regulate bodies gains importance at the level of state power in order to reproduce a workforce. With the rise of industrial capitalism, bodies are translated into a language of capital. What is deemed as, quote, unnatural is sex that is ungoverned. As it serves no value for the state or market. In regards to the relationship between population and utility, Foucault states the biological traits of a population become relevant factors for economic management, and it becomes necessary to organize around them as an apparatus which will ensure not only their subjection, but the constant increase of their utility. Sex for pleasure in the metropole and the colonies is haunted not only by the psychic and ideological fears and anxieties of Victorian moralism, but also by the presence of desires that are criminalized for having no role to play in the reproduction of an idealized mother country. So I would argue that these anxieties about sex are also always anxieties about race and about who can have sex for pleasure and about who can claim legal rights over their own body. So the right to choice that feminists have been arguing for, and I think should obviously continue to argue for throughout the whole course of human history, from one generation to the next, is really about the right to live one's own life and the right to bodily autonomy. And I think also about sex for pleasure. I would also argue that the right to choice is also about money and about women's rights and people's rights to have economic control over their lives and over their own careers. From the perspective of queer politics, abortion is also about sex for pleasure and control over one's own reproductive future and control over one's own health. And I think the right to abortion is also connected to transgender rights as well. The legalization of marital rape in India through the colonial countenance of women as property with colonial law also serves a biopolitical function, as it curtails the possible threat that comes from unregulated female sexuality, which could produce the wrong kinds of citizens, namely those who are not ideal workers or subjects for and of empire. As Michel Foucault discusses, the regulation and criminalizing of certain bodies cannot be separated from the positive investments made in other kinds of sex. Foucault suggests it is not simply that discursive powers of sex, articulated through institutions of disciplinary power, weigh on people or are internalized. Rather, a much more nuanced relationship exists between sex and power. So I'll finish the lecture by reading from this book that I've written about the Delhi gang rape case in queer politics. Foucault writes, "What I want to show is how power relations can materially penetrate the body in depth without depending even on the mediation of the subject's own representations. If power takes hold on the body, this isn't through its having first to be interiorized in people's consciousness. There is a network or circuit of biopower or somatopower which acts as the formative matrix of sexuality itself, as the historical and cultural phenomenon within which we seem at once to recognize and lose ourselves. So I would argue that this network or circuit of biopower or somatopower is never separate from homophobia, lesbophobia, transphobia, and white supremacy. So I'll again finish with this quote from Bell Hooks. To oppress a person is to render this person unable to make his or her own choices. According to Hooks, being oppressed means the absence of choices. It is the primary point of contact between the oppressed and the oppressor. So the choice of women of color to have abortions is really also about the choice of women of color to try to have successful careers and to make a certain amount of financial capital. And the construction of white women and white Christian and Catholic women as ideal mothers who cannot have abortions is also about a refusal to allow women to think about their lives in terms of careers and in terms of making a certain amount of financial capital that they can enjoy. So being oppressed means the absence of choices, and this can also involve economic choices and reproductive choices. So that's all for the lecture. I hope that you got something out of thinking about these debates and the readings. And the lecture has been discussed from a pro-choice perspective and from a feminist perspective. Thank you.